The first shot cracked the silence like a whip, and a second later the sky over Ralvek Ridge lit up with a violent bloom of plasma fire. Trees vanished in a wave of heat, and the dirt road leading to Outpost 13 buckled under the shockwave. A dozen armored figures leapt from the drop raft as it hovered, their exosuits gleaming with refracted energy. Inside the ruined outpost, buried under what used to be a reinforced comms tower, Xavier Nash coughed blood into the dirt. He didn't scream. There wasn't enough strength left to waste. His left leg was pinned under a collapsed steel beam, and judging by the way pain shot through his chest with each breath, at least 2 ribs had cracked. He tasted copper and dust, and something was definitely wrong with his shoulder, maybe dislocated, maybe worse. Still, he reached for his sidearm with his good arm, found it gone, and muttered, "Perfect." 2 meters away, a scout drone sparked and died, still faintly twitching. The screen on his forearm display blinked red. No signal, no backup, no extraction. His comm crackled faintly. "Status report," Commander Rythel's voice demanded, cold and mechanical. A response came from one of the armored aliens as it surveyed the wreckage. "No survivors detected. Human resistance neutralized." Xavier pressed his head against the dirt and exhaled slowly. He recognized the voice. The Virellan warriors. Elite strike force. Tactical precision, overwhelming strength. They'd been tearing through the outer colonies for months, and now they were here. He wasn't supposed to be alone. Outpost 13 had a full unit posted here 3 days ago. Now it was rubble and ash. A heavy footstep crunched nearby. One of the warriors, massive, at least 2.5 meters tall, stood surveying the wreckage, its 4 eyes scanning for anything worth salvaging. It stepped closer to Xavier's position. He didn't move. Not yet. His heart pounded like a drum in his ears. The alien turned slightly, its shoulder-mounted scanner sweeping over the debris. The beam passed over him once, twice, and moved on. Their scanners couldn't penetrate deeper layers of metal. That had saved his life. For now, the warrior moved on. Xavier waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then he grit his teeth and pushed against the beam. A searing pain shot through his leg, and he bit down hard on a scream that threatened to explode from his throat. He dug his good arm into the dirt and pulled, inch by inch, until he slithered out from under the collapsed structure. His left leg dragged uselessly behind him. Something felt loose and wrong in the knee. He rolled behind a toppled supply crate and fished a data stim from his belt pouch. It was cracked, but functional. He jammed it into the port on his forearm display. The screen flickered, then gave him a weak signal from the outpost's backup server. Just enough to show a layout of the area and the location of the storage bunker buried beneath the eastern ridge. If he could reach it, he might find an emergency kit. Maybe a working rifle. Maybe a way to send a distress signal. He began crawling. 15 minutes in, the pain became a dull roar in his body. He couldn't feel his toes. Every inch forward was a battle between survival instinct and the very real possibility of passing out. He reached the perimeter fence and paused. 2 Virellans stood guard near the ridge path. One carried a shoulder cannon, the other a blade longer than Xavier's arm. He scanned the area. A broken pipe vented steam nearby. He pulled a rock from the dirt and hurled it into the vent. The clang echoed. One of the guards turned and moved to investigate. Xavier threw himself behind a rusted panel and waited. The warrior stepped closer. Its weapon hummed with latent energy. As it passed, Xavier lunged with a piece of jagged rebar clutched in his hand. He drove it upward into the joint of the armor beneath the arm. The alien shrieked in surprise, spinning violently. Xavier was already rolling away, grabbing the dropped blade and dragging it across the exposed neck joint as the creature turned. The body hit the ground with a wet thud. The other warrior charged, roaring, and Xavier barely managed to raise the blade in time to deflect the blow. The impact knocked him flat, his wounded leg screaming. He stabbed upward with everything he had, catching the alien in the thigh. It staggered, and Xavier used the moment to crawl behind a boulder. "Human is alive," the alien shouted into its comm. "Damn." He grabbed the alien's fallen weapon and ran limp toward the ridge. Plasma fire scorched the air behind him, missing by centimeters. The burst of adrenaline dulled the pain, but not enough. He reached the ridge path and dove into the brush, tumbling down the slope and landing hard against a rock. The world spun violently, and he vomited into the dirt. The emergency bunker was close. He could see the entry hatch, half buried in moss. He crawled again. The keypad was still functional. He punched in the override code. The door hissed open. Inside, he found what he was hoping for, a medpack, a rifle, and a signal beacon. He tore open the medpack and jabbed a painkiller into his thigh, then wrapped his leg in a splint. Not perfect, but better than nothing. He activated the beacon. Mayday, this is Sergeant Xavier Nash, Outpost 13. Virellan assault underway. Request immediate extraction and heavy ordnance deployment. Coordinates locked in. The signal blinked green. The painkillers kicked in. He passed out. When he woke, it was dark inside the bunker. The hum of the beacon still filled the air. No sign of help. No sign of enemies. He checked the rifle. Loaded. Charged. He checked the feed from the outpost's external cam. The Virellans were regrouping, confused. One of their elite was dead. That didn't happen. Not to them. Not from a lone human. Commander Rifle appeared on the feed, barking orders. Find the survivor. I want him alive. I want to know how. Xavier leaned back against the wall and whispered, "You're gonna regret that." He spent the next hour rigging traps from the supplies he found. Trip-wire explosives, pressure mines, noise decoys. He couldn't run, but he could make them bleed. One by one they came, and one by one his traps took their toll. An explosion rocked the ridge. A Virellan was flung into the air, landing in a heap. Another triggered a noise decoy and caught a blade through the chest when he turned. Xavier's leg couldn't support his full weight, but he used crutches made from support rods to move from point to point, keeping them guessing. He didn't sleep. By dawn, only 4 remained. Commander Rifle stood at the edge of the ridge, armor scorched, eyes narrowed. "Where is he?" he growled. Xavier crawled through a ventilation shaft and emerged behind them. He fired. Plasma ripped into 2 warriors before they could react. Rifle turned, drawing a massive blade. Xavier raised the rifle and fired again. The weapon overloaded and exploded in his hands, throwing him backward. His ears rang. His vision went white. He felt hands drag him backward into the brush. Heard voices. Got him. He's alive. Then blackness. He woke 3 weeks later in a recovery ward on Terra Station 9. His leg was in a cast. His ribs ached with every breath. His shoulder had been reset. A nurse walked in and smiled. "Welcome back, Sergeant Nash. You've got visitors." A general stepped in behind her. "You took out a Virellan strike team by yourself," the general said. "They're rethinking their ground tactics now. You might have stopped an invasion." Xavier closed his eyes. "I want coffee. And a new rifle." The general laughed. "You'll get both. After rehab." Xavier nodded. He had time. They wouldn't underestimate him again. 39 days after the Ridge assault, Xavier Nash stood barefoot in the cold rehab chamber, wrapped in a sensor-threaded suit that clung to his skin like damp ash. The medtech adjusted an array of needles along his thigh, each one pulsing with microcurrent. A synthetic ligament was regenerating beneath the muscle, and the process itched worse than poison ivy. The medtech didn't bother with sympathy. "Try not to scream this time." Xavier didn't respond. Not because of pride, he'd already screamed plenty, but because his jaw was clenched too tightly to speak. The machine engaged. His leg twitched involuntarily, muscles spasming in patterns designed to retrain motor control. He grunted. Not a yell. Not this time. Across the room, the observation window darkened, revealing a figure behind it. Not a doctor. The posture was too rigid, arms folded, gaze fixed. After 20 minutes of induced agony, the machine powered down. 2% gain, the medtech said, peeling off the sensors. "Keep that pace and you'll be walking unaided in another month." Xavier's knuckles cracked as he gripped the bench. "I'll be running in 3 weeks." The medtech didn't argue. She left without a word. The figure behind the glass pressed a button. A door hissed open. A woman entered, draped in a charcoal uniform with a silver insignia over the heart. Her boots didn't make a sound. She carried no datapad. He squinted. "You're not military." "No. I'm from strategic integration." Her accent sounded Terran, but clipped. "Call me Lyra." He didn't offer a handshake. "You're here to debrief me again?" "Your file's closed. I'm not here for answers. I'm here because the Virellan Dominion just filed a formal protest." "Let me guess." I bruised their honor. They're claiming you used illegal tactics, that you violated interspecies combat accords. I was unconscious for half of it. They want you extradited. He barked a short, humorless laugh. Good luck with that. They're not joking. They've suspended all diplomatic exchanges. Pulled their envoys. Our ambassador on Virellan's Prime isn't returning messages. Xavier leaned back. And you think I triggered a war? No. I think you reminded them we're not what they assumed. She tapped a signal tag on the wall. The lights dimmed. A hollow map bloomed into view, showing a cluster of systems near the outer rim. Bright red markers pulsed along the border. That's their new fleet posture, she said. They've moved strategic carriers out of reserve. Is this where you tell me I'm the symbol of some great Terran resurgence? No. This is where I ask if you're willing to break into one of their ships. He blinked. You're serious. We've got an asset inside the Virellan fleet. Embedded for 6 years. She stopped transmitting 3 days ago. Last signal came from a cruiser in orbit around Zethys 3. Same fleet that hit Outpost 13. He rubbed his temples. You want me to sneak on board a Virellan warship and what? Ask if she's free for lunch. We don't need charm. We need access to her data core. She was gathering telemetry on their warp signatures. If we lose it, we lose any advantage we had. He stared at the holomap. I'm still limping. You'll have help. Xavier narrowed his eyes. From who? The door opened again. A man entered, tall, wiry, with a face that had seen too many explosions and not enough sleep. One arm was synthetic, the plating mismatched and scarred. He grinned. Heard you made a crater with a rifle. Name's Goss. I break things. Xavier stood slowly. You look like something that broke you back. Several times. But I get up fast. Lyra gestured. You'll be inserted near their fuel lattice. You'll have 37 minutes before they cycle their internal sensors. After that, the ship's atmosphere goes lethal to humans. Goss cracked his neck. Plenty of time. They built their ships like temples. Beautiful. Predictable. Xavier's leg twinged as he shifted weight. What's the extraction? There isn't one unless you finish the job. Once the data's transmitted, we can pinpoint you for pickup. Not before. He looked at Lyra. You planned this before I could walk. We were hoping you'd be willing by the time you could. He sat again, flexing the repaired leg. The muscle trembled but held. I'll need a suit. Not standard. Something flexible. No exo support. We've already fabricated one. Goss raised a brow. You're either nuts or desperate. Both, Xavier said. 36 hours later, they were inside a stealth insertion pod, buried in the shadow of a rogue asteroid. The cruiser loomed ahead, its hull shaped like a spiraling fong, lightless, except for the occasional pulse from its internal reactors. Goss adjusted the clamp on his wrist. Their entry ports are coded to pheromone signatures. We'll be using a bypass. Xavier slid on the glove of his suit. Define bypass. Fake pheromone gland. Don't worry. Smells like citrus. I hate citrus. Then you'll hate the next 20 minutes. The pod detached from the asteroid and drifted. No engine burn. No signal. Just momentum. They struck the cruiser's ventral flange with a dull thud. Goss activated the mag clamp and sliced through the paneling. The interior opened like a wound, steaming faintly. Inside, the corridors were narrow, curved, and pulsed with a slow, organic rhythm. Everything looked grown, not built. The walls were semi-translucent and veins of power flickered beneath the surface. Xavier whispered, this ship is alive. Partially. They use biosymbiotic tech. Makes it harder to hack. It also means we can't stay in one place too long. The ship will notice. They moved quickly, avoiding patrols. Virellan soldiers passed by in silent formation, their armor clicking softly as they walked. Xavier's leg ached, but the suit compensated just enough. They reached the central chamber. A vault-like room with a core suspended in midair, rotating slowly. A dozen tendrils of light connected it to the ceiling, floor, and walls. Goss took out a probe. I'll copy the data. You watch the door. Xavier nodded, rifle ready. Minutes passed. Goss frowned. Something's wrong. This isn't just telemetry. She was logging command hierarchies. Names. Transport schedules. They'll kill her if they find this. Xavier didn't look away from the corridor. Then we make sure they don't. Goss pulled the chip, sealed it and slid it into a pouch. We've got 7 minutes. Movement. A warrior stepped around the corner, eyes locking on Xavier. Xavier fired. The plasma bolt hit center mass. The alien staggered, but didn't fall. Another shot, this time to the throat. The body dropped, armor sizzling. Alarms screamed. Goss cursed. Too late for quiet. They ran. The ship shifted around them, walls reconfiguring, closing off routes. Goss threw a charge at a sealed bulkhead. The explosion knocked them off balance, but the way cleared. Xavier felt the strain in his leg worsen. A sharp, tearing sensation. He didn't stop. They reached the outer hull again. The extraction signal blinked green for half a second, then cut out. He looked up. They're jamming. Goss pointed. Secondary vent shaft. Takes us to the dorsal antenna array. Line of sight to orbit. They climbed. The shaft narrowed. The suit scraped against the walls. Something organic pulsed along the ceiling, reacting to their presence. Xavier grunted. This thing's trying to digest us. Then we leave a bad taste. They reached the array. Goss deployed the transmitter. Signal up. 45 seconds. A bolt struck the antenna, sending sparks. Another hit the wall beside Xavier's head. He dropped, returning fire. 2 more Virellans charged. Goss lobbed a shock grenade. The first enemy spasmed and collapsed. The second raised a blade. Xavier caught it mid-swing, twisting. His shoulder popped again, but the blade dropped. He grabbed it, drove it up through the alien's chest. He gasped, falling back as the signal snapped green again. Above, a drop craft screamed into view. They jumped. The craft caught them barely. Inside, Lyra stood waiting. Goss collapsed, laughing. Told you. Plenty of time. Xavier lay on the floor, panting, leg twitching. She crouched beside him, holding the data chip. We've got our proof, she said. She's alive. She's still transmitting. Xavier closed his eyes. Then we go back. No, she said quietly. Next time we send a team. He didn't reply. He was already unconscious. 2 weeks after the cruiser extraction, Xavier Nash limped into the subterranean operations wing of Strategic Integration's Vault 6. Behind him, Goss dragged a crate of salvage tech, grunting with each step. Could have left this junk on the ship, Goss muttered. Half of it's melted. The other half looks like it wants to hatch. You're the one who insisted it might be tactically inspirational, Xavier said, pausing to shift his weight. You carry it. They entered a decontamination chamber where chemical mist hissed from the walls. The stench of ozone clung to Xavier's skin. He pulled off the top half of his suit and winced. A line of bruises ran from his ribs to his hip, darkening in strange, branching patterns. The medics had warned him about Virellan bioelectric residue. It lingered, pulsed beneath human skin like a second heartbeat. A technician waved them through. General's waiting upstairs. Wants a full strike analysis. Goss raised a brow. Didn't we already tell them we nearly died? They wanted in charts this time, the tech replied. Upstairs, a glass-walled conference room overlooked the edge of orbit. The planet below rotated in silence, its surface swirling with storm systems unfamiliar to either of them. At the far end of the table stood General Karan, a woman with silver-threaded hair and a posture that suggested she'd never once leaned on anyone, not even gravity. I read the telemetry, she said without looking up. You triggered a full personality shield in the ship's AI. That hasn't happened in decades. Xavier dropped into a chair with more force than necessary. Didn't know that was still a thing. Virellan ships aren't just programmed. They're imprinted with neural patterns from their command cast. What you accessed wasn't just data. It was a living command chain. Goss set the crate down with a thud. So we technically argued with a ghost? It would have killed you if it could, the general replied. But it hesitated. That's what's interesting. Xavier stretched his legs slowly, testing the range. You said we got our asset back? She's en route. Still under medical quarantine. But her intel confirms our worst guess. The Virellans aren't building a new fleet. They're repurposing their dead. Goss blinked. Come again. They've been harvesting neural residue from fallen warriors, encoding it into ship cores. Entire fleets composed of recursive minds. No emotion, no fatigue, just looped instinct. Xavier leaned forward. That's not war. That's a factory with weapons. And they're targeting the fringe colonies next, she said. They want our outer systems to fall without resistance. Goss cracked his knuckles. So what, we hit them again? No, she said. You already did your part. It's over. Xavier frowned. What do you mean, over? You were never meant to be a long-term asset, she said. You've been flagged for medical discharge. Effective immediately. He stood, ignoring the protest from his leg. I didn't crawl out of a crater just to be shelved. You did, she said. And you're going to recover. We'll do the rest. He looked to Goss, who shrugged. I'm just the demolition guy. Later that day, Xavier sat alone in a quiet mebe watching a nurse sterilize a series of joint injectors. His knee was swollen again, fluid buildup pressing against the surgical mesh. She prepped the needle without comment. You know, he said, I watched a man try to cauterize his own artery with a welding torch once. He didn't scream either. She didn't pause. That's not a contest you want to win. The needle went in. He grunted. She withdrew it, sealed the port, and handed him a cold pack. You've got microfractures in the femur head, she said. If you keep pushing like this, you're going to end up with nerve death. Better than desk duty. You'll be lucky if they let you lift a coffee mug by the end of the year. He didn't answer. The next morning, Xavier walked the perimeter of the rehabilitation deck, one slow lap at a time. The artificial sunlight above flickered in late cycle mode, casting long shadows over the track. He passed a woman in a translucent pressure sleeve, her arms suspended in a gel brace. She nodded without speaking. At the far end of the deck, a man waited, tall, bald, with a scar running down one side of his face like a bolt of lightning. His uniform bore no insignia. His hands were behind his back. I thought I told everyone I'm on medical leave, Xavier said. You're not on my roster, the man replied. Xavier eyed him. You're not military? No. I'm with the Civil Observation Board. He raised an ID chip. Xavier didn't take it. What do you want? We're compiling a report on the psychological implications of your actions. A lot of species are watching. Some of them don't believe you exist. Give them a mirror. The man didn't smile. You've become a symbol of anomaly. They're calling you the unquantifiable. Sounds like a bad comic book. To them, it's a crisis. A single soldier shouldn't be able to dismantle an elite strike team. It violates every projection model they've built. Xavier sat on a bench. Maybe they should stop building models and start meeting people. You're not special because you survived. You're special because you adapted in real time to a situation you weren't trained for. That's what scares them. So what now? You put me in a museum. No. We publish a paper. We let them argue about you in symposiums for years. Meanwhile, the next time a Virellan captain hesitates before engaging a human patrol, we win. Xavier stood. I didn't do any of this to make someone hesitate. Exactly, the man said. That's why it worked. By the end of the week, his discharge orders were signed. He received a standard commendation, a transfer packet, and a voucher for long-term neural therapy. The voucher expired in 6 months. He packed a single duffel, left the rest behind. He didn't say goodbye. 3 days later, he stood at the edge of a civilian dockyard on Mars Theta Port, watching cargo haulers lift into the sky like sluggish insects. He'd taken a contract with a terraforming outfit. Ground logistics. No weapons. No uniforms. A voice caught his attention. You always look this miserable when you're not bleeding? He turned. Goss stood behind him, a duffel of his own over one shoulder. Didn't expect to see you again, Xavier said. Didn't expect to turn down a demolition job either. But here I am. This isn't a war zone. Yet, Goss said. But give it time. They boarded the hauler together. No fanfare. No salutes. 1 week later, they were laying sensor plates along the edge of a newly pressurized basin. The air smelled like copper and ozone. A storm brewed on the horizon, slow and red. Xavier knelt to adjust a calibrator. You ever think they'll come here? He asked. Goss hammered a plate into place. If they do, we'll be ready. He didn't say more. He didn't have to. They worked until the storm broke.